We accept whiteness as normal and acceptable, but it never has been and never will be. We cannot create an anti-racist whiteness because to be white is to be racist. Those are the words of my guest, Daniel Blight. Have I said your name correctly?
Perfectly.
So, bro, me reading it as a black man, I'm thinking to myself, okay, ooh, that's a bit touchy. Not because maybe so much of the content, which I guess we can have a discussion around the content, but I can just imagine what the response of white people to that would be. So the question is, why did you write that, and why do you do what you do? Which seems a consistent theme in as well the book which you've published, Image of Whiteness. And thank you for sending it to me, by the
That's
way.
fine. Huh. I guess the reason why white people might not enjoy that statement or be able to, let's say, open it up in their own minds is because of a lack of willingness to be vulnerable to new ideas, and also a
Okay.
sense in which there's a massive ignorance among white people about the history of racial whiteness or what it is to be racially white. My
Mm.
basic position with respect to the line to be white is to be racist
Yeah.
comes from the idea that if you kind of trace a history of the invention of racial whiteness back to, say, the 17th century and
Yeah.
New World colonialism, it's hard to not see it as fundamentally a violent, murdering, land grabbing, aggressive force. So I'm trying to be
Yeah.
kind of realistic and real about what racial whiteness is and get people, white people especially, to think critically about it as it exists kind of within themselves.
Okay, so I can totally understand. I mean, as you quite rightly said, and I believe it's W.E. Du Bois who points out the creation of race. And he's so, and with the kind of late 18th century, we see the creation of race, and we see the kind of birth of scientific racism.
Mhm.
So I understand that, and we understand, and I do say, the categorization of people into races based on skin color is racist in and of itself.
Uh-huh.
So I totally get that. But then someone will come back and retort with, but okay, those white people then who created it was racist. Now it's just an identity that is that as you have black people, you have white people, you have people who are Chinese, you have people to whoever it may be. What's wrong with people identifying with that identity today?
Right. Well, I guess again, it's that thing of if you still identify with racial whiteness, if you think it's
Yeah.
a problem, you have to trace its negative aspects into the present day. And my
Okay.
position on this, and lots of people will deny it, and lots of people indeed do in the media, is that
Yeah.
systemic racism is still with us in a huge way. It's
Yes.
found, smart ways to hide and to kind of reduce its so-called importance in amongst sort of liberal conversation, but it's still there in
Yeah.
a fundamental way. I'm thinking
Hmm.
here of like Joe Fegan, the American sociologist's work in collaboration with another sociologist called Kimberly Ducey, where they kind of outline the idea of three oppressive systems that exist today, one being systemic sexism, another being systemic
Yeah.
classism, and then systemic
Yeah.
racism. So I think if you trace
Yeah.
the kind of history of racial whiteness in a pot or in a nutshell from the 17th century up to the present day, it still very much exists. So to kind of align yourself with it seems to be counterintuitive or oxymoronic if you understand the fact of it being a form of violence, effectively.
I understand. Again, I want to kind of push back and maybe explore that further
Uh-huh.
on the thing of historically, yes, people can. I mean, I'm not somebody who I consider myself quote unquote pro-black. People can understand what they mean from that as they wish. But people would say historically, yes, for the last 400 years, undoubtedly, white people on the face of the earth has shown they can be extremely violent, and they have been extremely violent. Yeah, but in kind of move the conversation forward into modern day. And again, we've moved from what we say illiberal racism to more liberal racism, where it's more an institution, it's more systemic and systematic, and that which permeate our institutions. Understood. But as an identity marker, can white people then not be racist? Then are you saying the white? Because I mean, another part in your book, you say to be white is to be intrinsically racist.
Well, I'm basically
Surely that can't
suggesting
be.
that there's a paradox at play. Like, if you
Hmm.
accept that you're racially white, as I do, for example,
Yeah.
I can't, in good sense, simultaneously accept that I'm not a racist because I am socialized to be racially white, which to me
Hmm.
equals racist. I can't, in my study of the history of racial whiteness, I can't save it in any way. I can't kind of find a way to recover it as an identity. I'm open to that idea, but I'm very dubious about the fact that it could be, resuscitated, if you like. It's basically a form of, social death from its very existence to the present day, as far as I'm understanding it.
Super, super interesting. So my question is, as a white person, how did you get to this position?
Right, that's a great question. Mostly through the work of an amazing American philosopher named George Yancey. I came across about 3.5 years ago a book of his kind of collection of essays,
Yeah.
philosophical essays on whiteness is the subtitle. The book's called Look for
Okay.
White, which is a kind of riff on that famous W.B. Du Bois line. The What I took from it is that there are deep questions to be posed about the nature of racial whiteness and whether it is anything that we can save. And George
Okay.
Yancey, at a conference I organized in 2017, posed the question, what if to be white is to be racist in a fundamental sense? So in, a,
Okay.
in terms of a kind of philosophical project, I owe an immense amount to that particular philosopher. Now, there are obviously a
Okay.
number of other scholars that pick up on these ideas. A number of them Americans, some British too. In the States, you've got kind of critical education scholars such as Zeus Leonardo, another philosopher,
Okay.
Barbara Applebaum, who write about these kind of social relations of, whether it's possible to be both simultaneously good and white, for example. So yeah, I'm kind of through scholarship, I guess, I've come across these ideas.
So that's super interesting. So you're going the full mile then, because I would say we have to challenge the notion of white supremacy, for example, and white privilege, whereas you would say you have challenged the notion of
Oh, you seem
whiteness
to
in
be
and of
cutting out a
itself.
bit.
So yeah, I mean, I definitely would agree with you in that. Yes, we challenge the white supremacy, of course, and white privilege, but you're going the full mile, as it were, and saying we have to challenge whiteness in and of itself. And if you're challenging whiteness, what will replace it? What replaces whiteness then as an identity for people?
Well, I guess going back historically again, it's about kind of reversing that false connection between the invention of racial whiteness and white skin, which is really a
Yeah.
signifier, right, of racial whiteness. So the first thing,
Yes.
and I sort of say this in my book, is that my whiteness has very little to do with my white skin and much, much
Okay.
more to do with the way that I involuntarily subscribed to a particular kind of social system or social organization, in the
Yes.
sense that we live in a fundamentally white supremacist world.
Yes. What has been the reaction to you, by the way? I'm just curious to
Uh,
know.
Very mixed.
Okay.
So yeah, lots of disgruntled white trolls, but,
Okay.
like social media, but I don't take any of that stuff seriously because they don't sort of step up and meaningfully engage with the ideas, right? It's just sort of
Of course.
trolling, and then it ranges from like death threats all the way through to
Oh
like
wow.
open minded white folks being willing to have critical conversations.
That's okay. I can imagine people being disgruntled, but do you still feel like the way you do things is like the best course of action? Do you feel like it might just get people's backs up when and people just not being open minded, willing enough to engage?
I think so. In a sense, yeah. I've thought about this a lot, right? Because most of what I do is in the
Yeah.
classroom, and obviously, I'm not as polemical in a sort of teacherly context. Much
Yes.
more about presenting evidence and persuasion and sort of two sides of an argument. But in
Of
terms
course.
of
Yeah.
like the book and some of my critical writing, it's a lot more polemical. I mean, what I'm getting from black and brown scholars and scholars of color that have been working on these issues
Yes.
far longer than me is that like white people have had quite enough time to figure this shit out, and
Yeah.
there needs to be more people willing to sort of step up and be openly critical about this stuff. But at the same time, it's about education and about learning. So I hope I kind of get that mix right.
Yeah, trying to get the balance between educating people. I mean, the thing is, but do you not feel like with what we see rising Trumpism, rising populist and far right movements, that job has become all the more, much more difficult because there is like a pushback right now on what it means to be right and asserting whiteness as a form of dominance.
Yeah, definitely, especially with regards to it's called quote unquote white ethnicity. So
Yeah.
there are even kind of like senior academics in political science that are trying to reclaim the kind of notion of white ethnicities as something that obviously plural, but also can be positive, like, the idea being that it's okay to be white and that people shouldn't feel embarrassed about that. And I think that their intentions are good, but they fundamentally misunderstand what's at stake. And my kind of retort to that is it's absolutely fine to have white skin. There's very little you can do about
Yes.
that. But if you dig into the history of racial whiteness, there's very, very little positive aspects to be found or recovered. So I don't think whiteness is something that people need, that white skinned people need. They don't need to cling to it. But it's obviously tied in and bound to, capitalism, neoliberal capitalism,
Yeah, of course.
classism, etc., etc. So it's unpicking that as a sort of project, I guess.
Pushing back again, the person who says that, but okay, I'm white. So are you saying that it's the issue is identifying with white? Obviously, you said you can't choose change color of your skin. I mean, people can tan and people can bleach their skins. It works both sides,
Yeah.
but so people can't change their skin, but it's the identification with whiteness which is the problem, and that cannot be separated from being a racist.
Pretty much, because you can't. I mean, like, if you think about all the typical things that white people like to say they
Yeah,
did well, right? So one of the kind of
yeah.
aspects you see in
I was gonna ask you, you read my mind. I was about to go on like, okay, someone would say, we had a empire and all these things.
yeah,
This is our history, and then you see how people get upset with the removal of statues, for example.
exactly, absolutely. I mean,
Yeah.
here's a great example. The scholar Kahinda Andrews, professor of
Yes.
Black Studies at Birmingham
Yes.
City
So, yeah.
University, he was Good Morning Great Britain last year.
Are you making you're making a statement of whiteness is psychosis? I know you got in trouble
Exactly.
for that
And there
recently.
was another thing he said, I think it was in the same interview, which was that you can't compare, say, the British Empire to Nazi Germany, because what the British Empire did was far worse and over a much longer period of time. And
Yeah.
you can only imagine very, very, very few white people these days saying, like, publicly that they're Nazis. But you
Yeah.
can imagine a lot of people saying that they're proud of the British Empire. So, and that's just a
Mm,
question of ignorance, really. It's just kind of
yeah.
like
Yeah.
the way that people like me are taught in the UK is that we, be it consciously or unconsciously, must maintain a kind of white privilege and excitement and not see
Yeah.
clearly the state of the history of Britain. I wasn't taught any of that stuff in school, you know?
Yes.
So it's kind of a
So
question of
yeah.
education, going back to that idea, I suppose.
Of course, I mean, I think this is what I'm trying to do with this podcast, and obviously, I think the work you're doing is a form of education. The only way we're going to have any kind of change is through education. So the question is, you accept then there's something called white privilege. I mean, it's not a far stretch for me to say that, yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. 100%.
At which point then did you realize there was something called white privilege? Because it's very interesting. I think it's very important. It's so easy to become, black and white, pun intended, in these kind of dialogues with on race. You can be very, oh, okay, one way. This is only one way to see things, and I feel like sometimes it could be to the detriment of the argument. So I try to have a discussion. I think that what, when I speak to a lot of white people and they don't get where I'm coming from and they can't understand where I'm coming from, I understand in many ways that they are coming from a position where they've never had to question the positionality in this world.
Uh huh.
They've never had to think to themselves, am I getting this treatment because I'm white?
Exactly.
It's not even, it's not even coming in there. It's not even within their kind of remit of how they view the of lens of how they view the world in any way. Whereas for me as a black man, obviously, if I'm getting followed in the shop, for example, or I've had several racist incidents against me personally, some overt, covert, naturally because of what blackness is tied to and what it's seen in society and portrayed, I immediately go to, is it because I'm getting this treatment because I'm black, for example? So, you know, is it just the fact that we have to get white people to critically engage in what it means to be white? Because again, if you've never questioned your positionality in the world, how can you arrive at that? How can you arrive at that position? Because I mean, as a famous quote, I mean, someone that's been quoted a lot recently, if you're accustomed to privilege, equality feels like oppression.
Yeah, exactly. This is the issue with this kind of hyper white sensitivity, or however you want to phrase it, in which there's a kind of
Yeah.
immediate defense mechanism, which is psychological. And in a way, it's kind of human because it's about protecting yourself. And we all have
Yeah.
those impulses, right? And it seems,
Yeah.
if you listen to sociologists and psychologists, that we also have those impulses of protection in terms of our social groups. Uh,
Yes.
but the, for me, the question is, like, I stumbled across this idea of racial whiteness 3.5 years
Yeah.
ago. Hadn't heard a whisper
Okay.
about it before that. It was like
Yes.
I'd been taught a bit about like the fluid social nature of gender and about colonialism at
Yes.
university, but only very briefly. And so
Yeah.
it opened up a lot of questions for me. And the issue for me was like my own interests are at stake here, right? So there's
Mm-hmm.
two things happening, right? On the one hand, there's a kind of like a sense in which I hope I'm being open minded and critically driven to understand myself, vis-a-vis racial whiteness. But then there's
Yes.
also, and I'm kind of much more wary about this side of my own psyche, a narcissistic
Yes.
drive to understand what makes me white. And there is somehow a kind of
Mm.
hope in me that I might recover it, even though I know that
Okay.
fundamentally it's not something to be saved, basically. So I'm in that sense I'm an
Wow.
abolitionist, right?
Okay.
Which is to say that I don't think there's any use for racial whiteness, and the kind of quicker we get to a place where white people feel they don't need it, and of course it's important, as Kinder Andrews points out himself, to bring that guy up again.
Yeah.
Whiteness isn't just for white people, right? It's like it's a
Yeah.
social system that, irrespective of the color of your skin, you can take on and recapitulate and support.
Yes. Wow. Okay. Heavy. I mean, that's super super heavy. So yeah, at which point then did you realize? Like, which point did you question your positionality and realize it was a privilege? Was it something like a specific catalyst? Was it an event? Was it a moment? Like, if you don't mind sharing,
Yeah,
if you can think of one.
I mean, going back to George Yancey, it was literally just like reading the introduction to his book "Look a White" 3.5 years ago, and it
Yeah.
just basically blew my mind. And I was like, what is this? Like,
So it resonated with you then.
yeah, yeah. It basically rocked my sense of self, to put it frankly.
Okay.
And that's been a sort of
Okay.
continuation for the last like 3.5 years.
Okay, brilliant, man. Brilliant. This is going to probably be a very controversial episode. And I think a lot of people have a lot of pushback against it. But I think this is how we just, these have, I think it's very important we have these kind of dialogues, to be honest. I'm someone who's involved in anti-racist campaigning, and I kind of assume the role of trying to be an educator. And what you said in terms of in your book and your writing has been like, first time I've really heard it in this way. And a part of me wants to be like, okay, yeah, it makes a lot of sense. And I think you do have strong arguments, makes a lot of sense. But the kind of pragmatic side of me is like, but how feasible is this and how achievable is this going to be? And I'm sure you have the same kind of questions to yourself. So what do you think
Yeah,
of it? What do you
definitely.
think of these things?
Well, it's weird, isn't it? Because like recently we've heard this kind of academic idea of critical race theory being mentioned like by the
Yes.
president of the United States of America, right? And in the House of Commons 2-3 weeks ago.
And the Tory front bench.
Exactly. And that's wild because like I don't think any critical race theorist would have thought that they'd be getting, their subject to mention in like the Houses of Parliament. Just, it's
Yes.
always been a sort of very niche research area.
Yes.
But in various subtle ways, it's informed policy, especially with more left wing politicians, but
Yeah.
I think whether it's achievable is interesting because what we've seen with this like backlash against critical race theory, of course, lots of the
Yeah.
people that mention critical race theory in these like
Don't have a foggiest idea what it's
exactly.
about.
They don't know what they're chatting about, and that's pretty obvious by the
Yeah.
way that they assign all manner of things to that umbrella term when they don't really understand what it does specifically.
Exactly.
So that's one question, but it gives me sort of a weird sense of hope because it means there's a defensiveness on the right and in the
Yeah.
kind of white denialist camp that means
Hmm.
they are provoked by these ideas and
Yeah.
they potentially see them as a risk to the continuing dominance of neoliberal capitalism.
That's a very good point. I mean, if you look at Kemba Badenoch, who spoke about critical race theory in Black History Month, I mean,
Exactly.
she says that it is a Marxist and this and whatever, and she said if you teach white privilege as an uncontested fact, you could be face the law and all this crazy stuff, which are quite almost neo-fascist in many ways. But what stood out, she said that critical race theory teaches white people that they are the oppressors and black people are victims.
Right.
And I found that very strange. 'Cause I'm not sure critical race theory does that in that way, but okay,
No,
if that's what
I
she,
mean,
that's what.
not in the way I use it, and not in the way I've read any of the scholarship. I think this is a kind of
Yeah,
myth that's like been built up by a kind of a combination of things. One is on a kind of subtle critique of it amongst a number of political scientists. I'm thinking about Eric
Yeah.
Kaufman, for example, at Birkbeck, who wrote a book called White Shift,
Okay.
where he's, and it often takes the form of a general attack on postmodernism, which is
Yes.
like he takes kind of umbrage with a particular kind of theorizing that emerged in the 20th century, and then that often
Yeah.
gets lumped in with a kind of wider critique of CRT. But then on the other hand, there's
Okay.
a kind of much bigger volume, much louder volume of social media anti-CRT activity coming from people
Yeah.
like James Lindsay in America, for example. Now, it's kind of
Okay.
total assumption, but I'm thinking to myself, one of the reasons that a mention of CRT got made its way up to the president was
Mm-hmm.
because of people like James Lindsay, who have, on the one hand, the
Okay.
face of being scholars or academics. He clings to his maths PhD like it's the only thing
Yes.
he's ever done that was worthwhile, using it as a kind of badge of honor to drive through
Yeah.
what are actually quite ignorant positions. And
Yeah. Yeah.
he co-wrote a book with Helen Pluckrose that is, for lack of a better phrase, clumsy as fuck with respect to these ideas. Now, back
Yeah.
to like Kemi Badenoch, what's really interesting and really problematic about her position is
Yeah.
that in a matter of days, the government went from, and her speech, which is like, CRT is bad, to put it simply,
Yeah.
to the government quietly at 2 o'clock in the morning publishing a report. This was on the 11th
Exactly.
of November. The report was called Black People, Racism and Human Rights.
Yeah. Yeah. I read it.
Yeah, yeah. And you read the like second paragraph of the summary, and it's just like, it basically just says systemic racism exists and this government refuses to do
Yeah.
anything about it. And so it's kind of like,
Basically.
what's going on? Are they just hoping that people don't see the report? There are huge contradictions at play.
100%. 100%. And I wanted to speak about the phenomena, if you don't mind engaging. Finally, the phenomenon when we see things like people like Candice Owens, for example.
Right.
The phenomenon when we see these, and in the UK we have our fair share as well. These kind of, and I've always said that if you want to make it in mainstream media, you can be one of two people, one of two archetypes, if it were, as it were. You can be the white man who's obtuse and you make it in mainstream media, or you can be the black person who says things that white people wish they would want to say, basically, in
Right. Yeah.
public.
Okay.
When you see like Candice Owens stuff, what has, if you're gonna analyze that, has she just embraced whiteness? Is she just a grifter? What do you think?
I think it's like, what's really interesting, right, is that lots of these people that I fundamentally disagree with aren't stupid. I can't.
Yeah.
Candice Owens is an intelligent woman. Like Toby Young is an intelligent guy. So is Eric Kaufman. He's a professor. So is James Lindsay as a PhD in maths. Right. Even if I think those people,
If you think, okay, the rest of bar Candice Owens, I think I agree with you. I don't think Candice Owens is that
I
intelligent,
guess
but
not.
okay.
I'm trying to be sort of polite and give her some credit, right?
She's well spoken with that, okay, and she can argue.
Yeah.
That's what you mean.
I
And she
guess.
can argue very. She can present a coherent argument. I give her that. Fair enough.
Mhm.
Yeah.
So I've only really, I mean, I've seen like news clips and stuff. I think the most sustained like amount of time I've spent watching her is when she did a thing with Russell Brand on his vodcast.
Okay. Yes. Yeah.
I don't know. I just, the level of ignorance of history is so profound that it's so
It's so bad,
easy
isn't
just to
it?
switch
It's
off.
so bad.
Yeah, and I think
It,
in a sense that sums up the problem right there, doesn't it? We're not taught about these things in any, unless you
yeah.
do like a kind of, yeah, humanities or culture studies course or a sociology course
Yeah.
at like a left-wing university. You just don't hear about this stuff and you don't read it.
Exactly.
And so it's
Exactly.
a massive issue of like lack of access to this, what is an incredibly important part of history.
100%, 100%. I mean, I know people can engage with you in your writing and engage with you in your from your book and your Twitter, but if you're going to speak to the masses of white people right now, what would be a takeaway you would like to say?
To white people at large,
Yes.
just read The History of White People by Nell Painter, which is a great book and
Okay.
will kind of open your eyes and your mind to what people with our skin color have been through socially. I don't mean that in the sense that we've had it tough. I mean that in the sense that we've had a kind of collective experience of being massively dominant for 400 years in an incredibly violent way. Like
Hmm.
any individual who's violent collectively we have to take responsibility for what we've done in the world we've literally made and continue to hang on to. There's
And,
one example. There's a number of other books I could
yeah,
mention.
and I think it's very interesting actually. I feel like two things that kind of pop up to mind and they always stick into my head when I think of race dialogue and race relations. The first thing I believe is, the race worker Jane Elliott, I believe, when she goes, her famous kind of room full of white people, stand up if you'll be comfortable with treating black people, if the society treated you as black people are treated, and no one stood up.
Right.
And then equally, when you see, Amy Cooper famously said, "I'm going to call police and say there's a black man here." And I thought that's very scary because day to day, I'm sure Amy Cooper probably was a lovely person. I'm probably she had black colleagues. I'm sure she stood behind black people on the line. Like overtly, she wasn't racist, but she knew she could weaponize her whiteness and get someone potentially killed.
Yeah,
And I thought that puts a lot of people on edge. If I'm honest.
yeah, I think that does. It's an interesting point because it's like there's so much kind of unconsciously at stake, right? There is a kind of deviant side in
Yes.
which a white person consciously mobilizes or weaponizes their whiteness,
Yeah.
and that's like venomous. But there's also a sense in
Yeah.
which like all white people mobilize their whiteness on a daily basis without knowing it. And
Okay. How
that's
so?
a question for psychology, isn't it? And
Yeah.
there's lots of interesting research done in that area too.
Okay. Brilliant, brilliant. Thank you so much for talking to me, man. Where can we get your book first and foremost?
You can get it through. It was co-published by Self-Publish Be Happy and Art on the Underground, which are an organisation funded by the Mayor of London, and you can get it
Okay,
through the Self-Publish Be Happy website,
okay.
straight off their website.
That's called The Image of Whiteness, isn't it?
Yeah, the Image of Whiteness.
Image of Whiteness, and people can find you on social media. I'll post Daniel's socials in the comments. Thank you so much, guys. Thanks for joining me. This is the Malcolm Effects. Please like, comment, and subscribe wherever you listening from, be that Spotify, Apple Podcasts, or YouTube. Until next time, peace out.